Welcome to my screencast on the introduction to cells as the building blocks of life and the structural basic unit of all living things, and the components and the cell parts within them. You won't get a huge amount of information here from this introductory screencast. You'll be doing some research on your own to go into more depth to the cell parts and the organelles. Essentially, there's a couple ways to look at different types of cells that kind of occur in pairs. First of all, we can take a look at simply animal cells versus plant cells, and note that for the most part, with the exception of a couple things that we'll note, for the most part, they have the same cell parts, animal cells and plant cells. But another kind of pairing that we can look at for cells would be what we call prokaryote cells and eukaryote cells. Or another way to say this is prokaryotic cell and eukaryotic cell. For the most part, we think about prokaryotic cells as being a little less complex than the eukaryotic cells, and as well as for size. Cell size comparison, most bacteria, which make up the vast majority of prokaryotic cells that we're talking about here. There's some classification distinctions that we don't need to make right now, but most bacteria are about 1 to 10 microns in size. So somewhere, and basically talking about the length of these bacterial cells. A micron is another name for a micrometer. Now, as you can see here, a micrometer is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. So if you think about a meter, kind of stretch out your hands. If you were about 6 feet tall, then from hand to hand it would be about 2 meters. Or you think about a meter as being pretty close to like a yard on a football field. Another perspective is that there's 1,000 microns or 1,000 micrometers in a millimeter. So if you just take your fingers, your thumb and your forefinger right now, and you hold them about a millimeter apart, there's 1,000 micrometers in that millimeter. So we usually use micrometers to talk about cell size. Simply put, why study cells is that cells are indeed the basic unit of both structure and function in all living things. So if they are the basic structure and functional unit in a body, and then cells together make up specific tissues, and tissues make up organs, organs make up organ systems, and then you would have an organism. So everything really that happens at an organismal level, like as a human, as a tree, as an ant, as a fungus, all of those functions take place at the cellular level. So all of these functions take place at the cellular level. The jobs that the cells have to do, they may be specialized, of course, depending on whether it's a muscle cell or a nervous cell or a fat cell or perhaps an endocrine or a gland cell, a skin cell, etc., etc. But they all have to do these basic things. They have to breathe. Now don't get that confused with the way that you suck in air and blow out air. They respire, but not with like lungs and a diaphragm. But there has to be an exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen. They eat. They may not have jaw muscles and they may not chomp on food, but they have to acquire free energy from their surroundings. And then what they'll do is they'll digest those macromolecules and they'll release energy. They'll release energy in the form of what's called ATP. My A, T, and P got off a little bit here, but should look like this. ATP, adenosine triphosphate, one of the most important biological molecules that there is. It's the currency of energy for getting work done in living things. But then cells can turn around and use the ATP to build molecules back up again. So as we kind of already talked about when we talked about we talked about chemical reactions, the digestion and the synthesis reactions happen and are linked to one another. Of course, they have to remove waste. They control internal conditions when the external condition is continually changing. And of course, they have to be able to replace themselves. Whether we grow, you have more cells now than you did when you were 6 months old. You've probably fallen down and you've probably scraped a knee or something. You've had to make new cells. When your skin heals, that's what it's doing. Of course, some cells in the body, like most neurons or nerve cells, don't repair themselves or don't replace themselves. And of course, there's specific cells in the body, like in humans we're talking about, specific gametes called sperm cells and egg cells. All of these functions and jobs have to be completed by the cell. It's really, really important to note this, that you may see this little cartoon drawing or an artist's rendition of a cell over and over in this screencast, but it's so important, some students get hung up on this, that they can't apply this or make a leap to another drawing or an actual photomicrograph that they see in another source. It's really important to familiarize yourself with the structures and the functions of these cell parts so that you can apply it on the next the test that you see, the next resource you see, the AP test or exam that you take. They aren't all going to be the exact same drawing, and that's okay. We said that cells need to make energy. They have to be able to produce ATP from the macromolecules, essentially the food that they take in. They digest it, and of course you remember when you break bonds in macromolecules and digest them into their smaller parts, that is going to release some energy. So most organisms, along with the food that they eat and the oxygen that they take in, at the cellular level they're going to make ATP. So somehow you have to get food from your digestive tract to all the cells in your body. Somehow, as a human, you have to get oxygen molecules from the lung tissue all the way to every single cell in your body. And they have small organelles, little organs that get all this work done. First of all, the cell membrane. It's so important that we'll almost have an entire chapter, well, we will have an entire chapter, a unit of study, on just what the cell membrane does. Its function and structure are both key to how life sustains and how cells are able to function. It, of course, separates the cell from the outside, so it separates the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. And what is maybe even most important is that it controls what enters and leaves the cell, whether it's oxygen, carbon dioxide, food, wastes, etc., etc. And because of some of the things that are embedded in the cell membrane, here's just kind of another drawing of the cell membrane, some of those things allow communication and signaling from one cell to the next. We'll again talk more about the structure. The structure, it's called a phospholipid bilayer because there's essentially two layers of these lipid molecules. And embedded in them are receptor molecules, specific proteins that are going to recognize certain compounds and specific compounds. You can pause here and review these first couple of cell parts. Vacuoles and vesicles. Vacuoles serve a variety of functions depending on the cell that they're found in. In most animal cells where vacuoles occur, they function as the temporary storage of food or nutrient substances. In plants, certain types of vacuoles play a huge part in maintaining the turgor pressure, which is actually the water pressure inside of a plant cell. Think about the difference between a normal healthy plant or flower that you can think of and a wilted plant. Well, a wilted plant is where the cells, the plant cells, have lost all the water out of their vacuoles. Vesicles are typically functioning in the transport of different compounds within and between cells. Substances within a vesicle are typically and often the cellular products that the cell is producing, or maybe even byproducts of what the cell is producing. So again, in plants, this large central vacuole, it's what keeps the plant supported. Remember, plants don't have skeletons, so part of their strength and support is having that essentially that little compartment filled with water. Think about a water balloon. Think about the amount of pressure that a water balloon is as you as you fill up water to the inside. The contractile vacuole of some things called protists, small single cellular cells. The contractile vacuole helps maintain a water balance, just like plants, but also a salt balance, so they can keep the right concentrations of materials to help keep them alive. Lysosomes are going to do some sort of digestion of some type. They're going to contain chemicals to break down macromolecules into their smaller component molecules, macromolecules and polymers into their monomers. They're going to digest and be able to recycle a lot of components. Sometimes broken down organelles, they're able to kind of tear them down and use the component parts to build new ones up again. You can pause here to review these cell parts. Mitochondria. Mitochondria, they function in making this ATP molecule that we talked about. ATP, adenosine triphosphate. They produce that from a process called cellular respiration, which we will look in great depth later on in the course. But essentially it's the food, the sugars that you eat, at least with animals, plus the oxygen that they breathe in, and they produce this ATP molecules. It actually occurs in both animal cells and plant cells. Plant cells still have to get work done. Therefore, they have mitochondria. They may not breathe in oxygen, but they do use oxygen in their cells, plus the sugars they produce to produce ATP molecules. Pause here to review these cell parts. So plants can make energy in two ways, and they typically use those energies a little bit differently. Again, what we're talking about is the ATP molecule. My ATP here for the screencast kind of got off here, but in the mitochondria, plants are going to make energy from sugars, small carbohydrates, plus their oxygen through a process called cellular respiration. Plants do indeed respire with a process called cellular respiration. They also have the chloroplasts, which you're probably quite familiar with. They make energy plus sugar using the sunlight as the original energy source. So in a process called photosynthesis at the chloroplast, they're going to use the sunlight plus carbon dioxide, and what they will produce are complex or simple sugars, carbohydrates, but as a byproduct, they'll have ATP. So ATP is going to be the active energy. The sugar is where the plants are going to store energy until you or I or cattle come along and eat those plants. So it's important to know that this is usually the one that kind of gets overlooked with plants, and we think that plants only utilize photosynthesis, but that isn't true. Plants do have to get work done. You can review the cell parts in this slide. As we said before, plant cells and animal cells have almost all of the same organelles or cell parts within them. And here we're looking at a plant cell. Again, it's just a drawing, it's a cartoon picture. Some artist made this thing. But typically, if you're looking at a plant cell, you'll be able to see a couple different things. First of all, you may see that large central vacuole that we talked about, which controls mostly the water content in the cell. Also, they have, besides just their regular cell membrane, they have a structural support called a cell wall on the outside. Animal cells don't have a cell wall. And then maybe the most obvious thing here are these green looking things, and we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail, but those are the chloroplasts. That's where the ATP and the sugars are produced in the process called photosynthesis. Cells also need workers, and the workers here are proteins. Remember, proteins, large macromolecules that are very complex, but they get things done. We just got done talking about the importance of specific proteins that act like catalysts for chemical reactions called enzymes. But to make proteins, they're going to run the day in, day out, if you will, functions that the cell needs to control. They need to read genes, which is the DNA, the nucleic acid, that is the blueprint for life. we have structural proteins, we have enzymes that we've talked about, we have signals and receptors that allow cells to talk or communicate or signal with chemicals and other cells outside of their own barriers. So a couple of the organelles that are involved in this for you to look up are the nucleus, the ribosome, the ER, endoplasmic reticulum, and Golgi apparatus. We will for sure talk about protein and its synthesis, the making of proteins, in quite a bit of depth down the road. But according to the blueprint, the DNA blueprint, DNAs are going to make proteins, and it's those proteins that do all this work. They are structure, they are enzymes that get things done, they are signalers, and they are receptors within the cell membrane of the cells. Proteins have a huge job at the cellular level. The nucleus, the brain of this operation at the cellular level. The nucleus's function is to control the activities of the cell, to determine what the cell's job is going to be. Because the DNA is housed inside of this nucleus, then it's going to be the instructions for building the cell products, for doing the cell activities or secreting a particular cell product. The DNA is the instructions and the written blueprints, if you will, the molecular blueprints for the cell's job. You can pause here to review the cell parts. Ribosomes have the function of being the protein factories, where proteins are actually put together. The instructions that come from the original blueprint, the DNA molecules, are actually going to be put together as finished proteins, whatever those proteins may be and however they may function. They may be enzymes or they may be structural proteins. The importance or the structure of the ribosomes to know about is that there's a large subunit and there's a small subunit. Some are actually free in the cytoplasm, and some are attached to the endoplasmic reticulum, which would then be called the rough endoplasmic reticulum. You can pause here to review the cell parts. The endoplasmic reticulum, there's two types of the endoplasmic reticulum, rough and smooth, depending on whether or not they have ribosomes attached. And the endoplasmic reticulum basically functions as an internal membrane that is going to transport substances throughout the cytoplasm. What this can lead to is it can increase the likelihood of certain cellular products of basically bumping into each other, putting them in close contact with one another, putting enzymes in close proximity to substrate so that chemical reactions can take place. Again, pause to review these cell parts again. The Golgi apparatus, or the Golgi bodies as some sources call them, will function as kind of a final shipping and receiving department. These are typically going to be products of the cell that are going to wind up in vesicles, little parts that are going to kind of pinch off of the Golgi apparatus, these flattened sacs themselves. And they're going to be finished typically for kind of export or for secreting of the cell. Examples of these might be enzymes or proteins that act as hormones. They'll be kind of housed in these vesicles and moved to the cell membrane to be exported by the cell. Pause, review. This is just a slide to review this process of proteins. The proteins are all going to start, or actually before they become proteins, they're going to be instructions. Kind of like before you have chocolate chip cookies, you've got a recipe on a page in a book or on a recipe card. But these instructions are going to be read in or outside of the nucleus, in the cytoplasm, somewhere at a ribosome, to be put together into an actual protein. And these proteins will be traveling through this expansive network of pathways involving both the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus to be prepared to be exported, either used by the cell somewhere or exported to be used somewhere else in the organism. This in particular is a view of a plant cell. Again, just a drawing, and review the parts of this plant cell and see if you can review the differences that you would find between a plant cell and an animal cell. Of course, when you're talking about cells, you know that cells need to make more cells. Cells need to produce more cells for a number of different reasons that we've already discussed a little bit, to talk about replacing old worn-out cells that have ceased to carry on living properties, to repair and to grow. Things that have to happen is they have to make a copy of their DNA. The new cells have to have the same instructions as the old cells. They have to copy all their organelles. They need to have the exact same, essentially, replica of themselves when the cell basically splits. Again, we'll talk about cell division and the types of it down the road in the course, but essentially here we know that the cells, for growth, for repair, for replacing, they have to essentially double themselves, duplicate themselves, and split. Without really going into much detail about cell division, the idea of what centrioles do is kind of tough to grasp, but they help coordinate cell division. And really what they do is they act as anchors and motors that are going to make sure that the genetic information is going to be split evenly and correctly when this cell splits. So when this cell actually splits into two individual cells, when it splits right down the middle here, the centrioles help to make sure that each of them have the correct DNA or chromosome or genetic information components. So for the last time, you have a way to pause and review all of the cell parts that we've talked about. In review, there's three big jobs that the cell has to do. They have to make energy. In order for a cell to be alive, remember, there has to be a constant input of energy. Cells, as a smaller piece of an organism, they have to obtain free energy from their environment to stay alive. They have to make proteins. They have to make proteins that help them function to carry out chemical reactions depending on what type of cell that it might be, or to be able to produce a certain type of protein as a product, whether it's secreting of a hormone or secreting of a particular enzyme. There's a particular product that many cells have to do. And all cells at some point during development have to make more copies of themselves. They need to be able to copy the DNA and divide it up evenly and properly so that there aren't any mistakes in a particular organism. Now, of course, we know as a side note that some cells, for instance in a human body, aren't very good at this. For instance, muscle cells themselves and nervous cells in the human body aren't good at replacing themselves. So thanks for paying attention. Kind of a long screencast about the individual cell parts. Remember, it's just an introduction. You have to go to different sources and obtain some more detail on your own for the functions of the cells and functions of the cellular parts inside of them.